have to deal with it. You say tax reform is a powerful lever to spur economic expansion. You're calling for a 10% income tax and a 16% business tax. What other elements do you need in this plan to actually create jobs?
Well, Maria, it's great to be with you. It's great to be here in Milwaukee. You know, the question you asked really, I think, is the most important question any of us can face, which is how do we get the economy growing? How do we bring back economic growth? Because economic growth, it's foundational to every other challenge we have. As you rightly noted, from 2008 to today, our economy has grown 1.2% a year on average. The Obama economy is a disaster, and the IMF is telling us this is a new normal. It doesn't have to be. If you look at the history of America, there are three levers that government has had to facilitate economic growth. The first is tax reform, and as you noted, I have rolled out a bold and simple flat tax, 10% for every American that would produce booming growth and 4.9 million new jobs within a decade. The second element is regulatory reform, pulling back the barriers that have descended like locusts on small businesses. And the third element is sound money. Every time we pursued all three of those, whether in the 1920s with Calvin Coolidge or the 1960s with JFK or the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, the result has been incredible economic growth. We have done it before, and with leadership, we can do it again.
Thank you, sir.
Excuse me.
Governor Bush.
Yeah. I would like to make a comment.
The retirement age and reducing benefits for future retirees. But reducing any sort of benefits for the elderly has always been notoriously hard to do politically. When Speaker Paul Ryan proposed replacing traditional Medicare with federally funded private plans a few years ago, a Liberal group responded with a commercial that featured a granny being pushed off a cliff. What's going to be different this time?
Well, my mom is here, so I don't think we should be pushing any grannies off cliffs. And you misstated what I've said on entitlement reform. What I've said is for seniors, we should make no changes whatsoever. For younger workers, we should gradually raise the retirement age. We should have benefits grow more slowly, and we should allow them to keep a portion of their taxes in a personal account that they control and can pass on to their kids.
I said for future retirees, as you said.
Now, I want to go back to the discussion we had a minute ago because, you know, what was said was right. The Democrats are laughing. Because if Republicans join Democrats as the party of amnesty, we will lose. And, you know, I understand that when the mainstream media covers immigration, it doesn't often see it as an economic issue. But I can tell you for millions of Americans at home watching this, it is a very personal economic issue. And I will say the politics of it would be very, very different if a bunch of lawyers or bankers were crossing the Rio Grande. Or if a bunch of people with journalism degrees were coming over and driving down the wages in the press.
See.
Then we would see stories about the economic calamity that is befalling our nation. And I will say, for those of us who believe people ought to come to this country legally and we should enforce the law, we're tired of being told it's anti-immigrant. It's offensive. I am the son of an immigrant who came legally from Cuba to seek the American dream. And we can embrace legal immigrations while believing in the rule of law. And I would note, try going illegally to another country. Try going to China or Japan. Try going to Mexico. See what they do. Every sovereign nation secures its borders, and it is not compassionate to say we're not going to enforce the laws and we're going to drive down the wages for millions of hardworking men and women. That is abandoning the working man.
Anyone in this audience or watching at home tonight who would not like to pay less in taxes? Most people just want a fair shake, and they don't want their money to be wasted. But explain how your plan works. How can you cut taxes as much as you propose without running up debt and deficits?
Well, sure, and you put your finger on what the problem is. The current system isn't fair. Washington is fundamentally corrupt. There are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible. And not a one of them is as good. Every one of them reflects a carve-out or a subsidy, and it's all about empowering the Washington cartel. My simple flat tax says that for a family of four, for the first $36,000 you earn, you pay no taxes whatsoever. No income taxes, no payroll taxes, no nothing. Above that, every American pays 10% across the board, a flat, fair tax, which means that no longer do you have hedge fund billionaires paying a lower tax rate than their secretaries. On the business side, I've got a business flat tax of 16%. Again, that applies across the board. Right now with our corporate income tax, giant corporations with armies of accountants regularly are paying little to no taxes while small businesses are getting hammered. This is fair and across the board. Now you ask, how do the numbers add up? I would encourage folks, if you go to our website, tedcruz.org, we have the specific numbers on the website. This plan eliminates the payroll tax, eliminates the death tax, eliminates the corporate income tax, and it abolishes the IRS. And the effect of that is incredible economic growth. It means every income group will see double-digit increases from the very poorest to the very weakest of at least 14%. So if you're a single mom, if you're making $40,000 a year, what that means is an extra about $5,000 in your pocket to provide for your kids, to make ends meet. It has a powerful, powerful effect. And there's one other really powerful feature of my plan, which is that it's border adjustable, which means if you're an exporter, if you're a farmer, if you're a rancher, if you're a manufacturer, you don't pay the business flat tax. Exports are free of that tax, but all imports pay that 16% business flat tax, which means this tax plan would cause jobs to boom, and it would let America compete with China and the world on a level playing field.
But you haven't told us how to pay for it.
Well, the numbers the Tax Foundation have put out is that the static cost of the plan is $3.6 trillion over 10 years. But the dynamic cost of the plan, which is the cost that factors in growth, is about $768 billion. It is less than $1 trillion. It costs less than virtually every other plan people have put up here, and yet it produces more growth, and it's one of the very few plans that abolishes the IRS. But on top of that, today, we rolled out a spending plan, $500 billion in specific cuts, 5 major agencies that I would eliminate: the IRS, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, and HUD. And then 25 specific programs. Again, that's on our website at tedcruz.org. You want to look at specificity? It's easy for everyone to say, cut spending. It's much harder and riskier to put out chapter and verse, specifically the programs you would cut to stop bankrupting our kids and grandkids.
Thank you, Senator.
Which is that it is exactly right that we have to defend this nation. You think defending this nation is expensive, try not defending it. That's a lot more expensive, but you can do that and pay for it. You can do that and also be fiscally responsible. You know, I mentioned the 25 programs that I put out today that I would eliminate them. Among them are corporate welfare like sugar subsidies. Let's take that as an example. Sugar subsidies. Sugar farmers farm on roughly 0.2% of the farmland in America, and yet they give 40% of the lobbying money. That sort of corporate welfare is why we're bankrupting our kids and grandkids. I would end those subsidies to pay for defending this nation.
Senator, we need to move on.
This is why we must combine, actually, zero-based budgeting with tax reform.
On that theme, Facebook data shows that over the last month alone, nearly 1 million people, nearly 1 million, have been concerned about reining in Wall Street, apparently believing that some have not been punished enough. So as an accomplished litigator yourself and a former Solicitor General, would you go after the very people who believe and fear that Wall Street has ignored? In other words, the crooks that Bernie Sanders say have gotten away with a financial murder?
Absolutely, yes. I've spent much of my adult life enforcing the law and defending the Constitution. And the problem that underlies all of this is the cronyism and corruption of Washington. The opening question Jerry asked, would you bail out the big banks again? Nobody gave you an answer to that. I'll give you an answer. Absolutely not. And what we have right now is we have Washington as government gets bigger and bigger. The biggest lie in all of Washington and in all of politics is that Republicans are the party of the rich. The truth is the rich do great with big government. They get in bed with big government. The big banks get bigger and bigger and bigger under Dodd-Frank, and community banks are going out of business. And by the way, the consequence of that is small businesses can't get business loans. And it is that fundamental corruption that is why 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in and around Washington, D.C. Now, let me give you a contrast to Washington cronyism. Some weeks ago, a woman named Sabina Loving testified at a hearing that I chaired in the Senate. Sabina Loving is an African-American single mom who started a tax preparation business in the south side of Chicago. She found a storefront. She wanted to have her own business. She started a business. But then the IRS promulgated new regulations targeting tax preparers. They did it under a more than 100-year-old statute called the Dead Horse Act. Now, this statute and the IRS, in classic Washington crony fashion, had exemptions for lawyers and big fancy accountants, but Sabina had to pay $1,000 an employee. It would have driven her out of business, and Ms. Loving sued the IRS. She took the Obama IRS to court, and she won, and they struck down the rule for picking the big guys over the little guys.
Senator, I really want to be clear here. Are you saying, sir, that if the Bank of America were on the brink, you would let it fail?
Yes. Now, let's be clear. There is a role for the Federal Reserve. What the Fed is doing now is it is a series of philosopher kings trying to guess what's happening with the economy. You look at the Fed, one of the reasons we had the financial crash is throughout the 2000s, we had loose money, we had an asset bubble, it drove up the price of real estate, drove up the price of commodities, and then in the third quarter of 2008, the Fed tightened the money and crashed those asset prices, which caused a cascading collapse. That's why I am supporting getting back to rules-based monetary system, not with a bunch of philosopher kings deciding, but tied ideally
Sir,
to
I
gold.
understand that. I just want to be clear, if you don't mind, that millions of depositors would be on the line with that decision.
Well,
and I just
yes.
want to be clear. If it were to happen again, for whatever the reason, that you would let it go. You would let a Bank of America go.
So let me be clear. I would not bail them out, but instead of adjusting monetary policy according to whims and getting it wrong over and over again and causing booms and busts, what the Fed should be doing is, number one, keeping our money tied to a stable level of gold, and number two, serving as a lender of last resort. That's what central banks do. So if you have a run on a bank, the Fed can serve as a lender of last resort, but it's not a bailout. It is a loan at higher interest rates. That's how central banks have worked. And I'll point out, look, we had a gold standard under Bretton Woods. We had it for about 170 years of our nation's history and enjoyed booming economic growth and lower inflation than we have had with the Fed now. We need to get back to sound money, which helps in particular working men and women. What Washington does, the people who are doing well in the Obama economy, are those with power and influence in the Obama government. The people who are hurt are working men and women, and that's who we need to fight for.
Neil, that's a difference.
Out rich Wall Street banks, but not Main Street, not mom and pop, not Sabina Loving. Well, you just said an executive knows to step in and bail out a bank.
They were talking about what you would do with depositors. Would you let these banks shut down? My argument is going forward, the banks have to reserve the capital so that the people who own the capital start pressuring the banks to not take these risky approaches, Ted. But at the end of the day...
So you said you'd abandon philosophy and abandon principle, but what would you do if the bank was failing?
Because if during...
What would you do if the bank was failing?
I would not let the people who put their money in there all go down.
So you would bail them out?
No. As an executive, I would figure...
Note, she's got a lot of experience, but her policies have proven disastrous. If you look at foreign policy, Every region on the world has gotten worse. Under her leadership, we abandoned the nation of Israel. Under her leadership, radical Islamic terrorism has been under the rise. Under her leadership and Obama's leadership, Iran is getting $100 billion and on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon. Everything she's put her hand to is touched. And when we talk about the cronyism of Washington, Hillary Clinton embodies the cronyism of Washington. And I'll give you an example of that, which is the congressional exemption from Obamacare, which is fundamentally wrong. And I'll tell you this, if I'm elected president, I will veto any statute that exempts members of Congress. The law should apply evenly to every American.
Thank you. All right, I think it's fair to say you're not fans of Hillary Clinton's resumes. All right.
58 years ago, my father fled to Cuba. As he stood on the deck of that ferry boat with the wind and salt air blowing, he looked back at the oppression and torture he was escaping. And yet he looked forward to the promise of America. His story is our story. What ties Americans together is we are all the children of those who risked everything for freedom. America is in crisis now. I believe in America. And if we get back to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that built this country, we can turn this country around. I believe that 2016 will be an election like 1980, that we will win by following Reagan's admonition to paint in bold colors, not pale pastels. We're building a grassroots army. I ask you to join us at tedcruz.org, and we the people can turn this nation around.